Hello and welcome to today's Wolfram Institute Livestream. Today we have Professor Elan Barenholtz, um, director of the uh, professor at Florida Atlantic University, director of the Machine Perception and Cognitive Robotics Laboratory, and he'll be talking,
Co-director.
co-director, excuse me, and he'll be talking about nature's memory, language, autoregression, and the non-Markovian structure of natural computation. Elan, go ahead.
Thanks, Dugan. Super fun to be here. I've already had a chance to chat with you guys a little bit beforehand, and I think there's probably a fair number of people maybe in the audience who are a little bit familiar with what I've been obsessing about for the past about year and a half. But just a really quick sort of landscape bio, like in the movies, we kind of zoom in from the far shot. I uh, began my academic career primarily as a vision scientist. Um, Vision being the area of cognitive research that I thought was most well developed in terms of computational approaches. And I was kind of on the Bayesian side of things. And I was really searching for, almost in the literal sense, kind of a broader cognitive, a broader theory, computational theory of cognition. I spent a lot of graduate school being told that neural networks, or connectionism as it was called, or in previous years as PDP, parallel distributed processing, was a dead end and wasn't going to go anywhere. I didn't necessarily take that as gospel, but I didn't spend that much of my faculty's resources on what are now called neural networks or deep learning, or now conventionally it's just AI. But what I did in general was find myself somewhat disillusioned with the state of the field of cognitive science. It was kind of an amalgam of lots of different phenomena and theoretical frameworks, but no larger overarching theory. And in about 2012, 2013, Dr. William Hahn, he wasn't a doctor at the time because he's my graduate student, but now he's Dr. William Hahn, co-director of my lab. We started to really pay attention to what was going on in neural networks, and what became to be known as deep learning at the time. And the we built out this lab, the cognitive machine perception cognitive robotics lab, and the idea was to see how far you could go with this neural network approach in trying to capture certain kinds of uh, key properties of cognition. And we got somewhere. We had a really nice platform, a little robot car that was doing things like actually instantiating attention as it learned to go around the track and things like that. Um, I came to be somewhat optimistic again about the idea of a broader theoretical framework, namely neural networks themselves, as a possible approach to the brain. But it's still somewhat amorphous. And what happened in to the world a few years ago was large language models dropped. And in my opinion, that changed everything. It certainly changed everything in my life. And it did so in a couple of ways. First of all, it demonstrated that a lot of human cognition, what we think of as human cognition, is really linguistic cognition, and that you can capture a lot of, or maybe most of what we consider like human knowledge, categories, reasoning, decision making, all of that might all be encapsulated ultimately in the core computational framework of large language models. And in the particular, I ended up being fascinated by this very neat computational trick called autoregression. And I was just talking, Addie's probably on the call too. Now I use that phrase so often that there's like a drinking game. Whenever I say autoregression, throw one back. And it's this very, in some ways, extremely simple kind of property, kind of computational process uh, that, in my opinion, is what fundamentally solved language. And I'm going to make the case that it points to something much deeper and more fundamental about computation, and what I call natural computation. So that's the title: Nature's Memory, Language, Autoregression, and the non-Markovian structure of natural computation. The idea that the sequence, the history matters when we're doing computation. That it's not just where you are, but where you've been. That is really essential to being able to do certain kinds of computational tasks. And which kinds? Well, a lot of the ones that I think really matter. In the first case is, of course, language. And language, is I think that was the initial glitch in the matrix, in the sense that we were able to see in its sort of bare computational form all of the pieces necessary to do something that we may call a cognitive process. You just learn these relations between tokens during an autoregressive next token generation process. And if you do that, you solve a lot of cognition. And we're able to sort of see the whole thing. There's no hidden inner models or anything like that. There's no mental models. You don't have grounding. You don't have any of that stuff. And even without all that, you're able to do this incredible process that at least language, and I'm going to argue possibly more cognitively. And that led me to the idea that maybe this goes even deeper than cognition. It may extend even to other kinds of natural processes, things like immune system, developmental processes, and and this is extremely speculative, but physics itself, that physics sort of has a memory, that the sort of Markovian um, construct of you pack everything into the infinitesimally recent moment and then predict from there, and then go from there, maybe fundamentally limited in capturing the nature of actually the physical universe itself. And so that's kind of the very broad landscape of how I went from looking for a theory of the mind to ending up with something closer to a theory of everything. But it's not really a theory. It's a theoretical framework. It's a framework for thinking about how we think about things. So to say to some that a process, for example, is autoregressive isn't really the end of the story. It's the beginning of the story. And we're going to see examples of that even in the case of language, that the big mysteries are still remain, but they're now different kinds of mysteries than what we thought they were before. It's now that we from this framework, and I'm speaking with the royal we, not everybody, of course, the vast majority of humanity doesn't agree with me on this yet because well, frankly, they haven't been exposed to it. And even if they have been exposed to these ideas, they certainly don't necessarily agree. But my point is that if one does take this perspective, it gives you a new framework for thinking about how you can theorize about stuff. And that's why I'm so excited about it. And I'm really particularly excited to talk to you guys and to the Wolfram Institute, because if anybody's thinking about computation per se, it's sort of this group and this institute are thinking about computation as sort of the essence of how to think scientifically. And so you're my people. You may not agree with anything I say, but at least you'll disagree in a substantive way. It's kind of the core idea. I think we're all on the same sort of on the same page. Okay, so that was a little bit of a preamble, and I'm going to show some of my very few slides right now. Let me show my first one. I can share this.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so just some terminology and sort of laying out the basic. If I should make this full screen, that'd be better. No, I can't do that. There we go. I'll just present. How's that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. You guys see that?
Yes.
Yeah, looks good.
Okay, awesome. Okay, so there are two terms on that are on this page, and one of them is now familiar to everybody. I've already used it a couple of times, and that's autoregression. And if you are keeping up with the AI literature and language models, you might have heard this term before. Something autoregression, something's autoregressive, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about what that is, but also what it isn't. Um, and then there's another term, autogenerative, autogeneration, which I believe is my own term. I haven't encountered it in the wild, at least not in this particular context. And these two pieces are kind of the whole thing, the whole story that I want to tell that applies in the case of certain large language models. The best in class to date are autoregressive large language models. People may be familiar with diffusion models. Diffusion models, I'll talk about them very briefly. They're not autoregressive, but they are autogenerative. And so I want to explain what I mean by autogenerative. But for now, right now, I just want to point out that these are two kind of distinct ways of thinking about a computational system. And so let's start with autogeneration. And so what do I mean about what do I mean? What does it mean that something's autogenerative? So autogenerative means that a system's internal structure encodes its own rule of computation. This is why I don't like using slides because I don't actually want to read off of these things. I'm going to try to not do that. The example of an autogenerative system that the only really well-defined example is language. And in some sense, this is one of the key insights that I believe large language models have shown us. And by the way, step back. I think that large language models, and I already mentioned this, are gave us sort of a perspective, a new perspective, thinking about computation, but also really showed us what language is in a way that we didn't understand before. I'm going to talk a little bit about that as well. That they, by virtue of their ability to perform their competency, uh, given what they are, and especially what they aren't, really gave us a fundamentally new insight into the nature of language. And so we can now say that large language models themselves are autogenerative, and then we can say that, and then I make the case that language is autogenerative. So what do I mean by that? So what I mean is that when you train a large language model, what you're doing is you're exposing it to a whole big corpus of text. And you're asking that model, based on that corpus, whether it can produce more text. And it could do this autoregressively. That's one way to do it. It could also do it maybe based on a diffusion model. There may be other ways to do it. But one thing is very clear is when you are training these models, these are generic learning models. These are neural networks. They have millions, billions of parameters. And those parameters get tuned in order to solve a very specific problem that you give them. But the nature of that problem is always input, output. Here's an input, give me an output. And nothing about the model prior to exposing it to your training data tells the model what kind of input and output it's going to get. And there's no other rules within it besides take that input, do some transform of it, and then and through that transform, or many transforms, you're going to get a particular output. And then the rest of it is learning. It's really just tuning the parameters, tuning these things to get the correct transforms so that you go from your input to your output. You're basically ultimately, it's a learnable function. And the thing about these language models was that they're not provided with any other tools to go from an input from like, hey, ChatGPT, tell me a story about a hippopotamus who goes on, a river raft trip, and it can do that, right? It'll give you a story about that, and it'll deal with the difficulties, the logistic difficulties of a hippopotamus on a little raft. It'll take into account and deal with all of the physics problems, whatever it may be, but it will do it all linguistically, and it will do this not based on having been exposed to anything besides the corpus that it was trained on. And it's really important to point out at this point is that when we say the language models are trained on a corpus, what they're doing is they're just taking what's called tokenized versions of a sequence of these sequences of words, turning those words into some sort of vectors that can be represented in a computer, and then taking those vectors and learning how those vectors, well, I guess one of the way, that's not even the right way to put it, is figuring out how to encode those tokens, those numerical representations in such a way that it's able to do this input output function. And the by the time it's done, what it's done is just learned a representation of the linguistic corpus itself. And so what before we even get into autoregression, autogeneration means that what the model has done, what is mapped, what it's learned, is just the properties of the corpus. And if it's done a really good job of this, it's done it in such a way that it can now do something functional. Namely, if you give it an input, it'll give you the correct output. In the case of autoregression, what that means is it's what it's learned to do is given an input of a sequence, its output is going to be what it thinks the next token, what the next output, what the very next member of that sequence should be. And when I use the word tokens, just for people who are not familiar with that terminology, tokens are the way that any language model represents words in a sequence. And a token could be a word, but it isn't necessarily a full word. It could be like sometimes it'll split words into two. It'll turn a suffix or prefix into a token. But it's a way of getting those things into the machine so that a machine can process it. And so we're talking about like next token. Here's a sequence. The quick bound fox jumped over the lazy, and you're gonna say, what's the next token? So maybe that would be dog. And so we could think about it as next word. It makes it simpler. So for those purposes, if I say those, just think of them as interchangeably. So in the autoregressive case, that's what the model is doing. The model is saying, I'm learning how these words, these tokens, are all related to one another. I'm learning the topology of this corpus such that, and it's you optimize it such that that the structure of that, the way that builds out the topology, is that it's able to do this prediction, and it's able to say, okay, the quick frog jumped over the lazy, and it's able to give you the right output. And in the case of autoregression, what it does is produces that output, and then takes that output and tacks it onto the input. And so now you have the entire input is now, well, the quick brown fox jumped over the lazy dog. And what's next? I don't know, maybe a period, right? I don't know what's the appropriate thing to say after that, but it could be anything. And as we all know, because we all have used these language models, uh, if you chain this thing, if you do this chaining process of taking the next token prediction and then keep doing that sequentially, uh, language emerges. And what I would call understanding emerges, at least linguistically based understanding, such that you can give a very complicated prompt. You could say, here's a paper I read, and I have the following questions about this paper, and it will give you very reasonable answers to those questions. And if you say speculate on future research based on this, not as if I do this all the time, but let's just say, the large language model will give you even perhaps give you a kind of summary or lit review of that paper or something like that. And
So
so,
so autoregression is that incorporate a prompt and it's just like picking the next one
so
and then
autoregression is more general
I'm
than
sorry, auto generation. That's the
okay.
static
So
like
I
one
haven't
to the next, right?
I'm bouncing back and forth, so
Yeah.
I shouldn't have jumped to autoregression, but I was just saying that in the case of autoregression is how you do it. But come back to auto. Let's come back to autogeneration. Thank you. So autoregression is a particular way you can use the structure of language in order to generate language by doing it in this kind of produce next token and then feed it through. However, what makes the system autogenerative is that all you are doing is the only rules you need in order to produce more language are the rules contained within the corpus itself. That the corpus contains within itself the rules for its own generation, because that is all that the system is learning. The prediction is just a way of leveraging it, but there aren't any additional rules.
So for
So for
language, what would those
example,
rules be? Like the syntax, I guess.
syntax.
Ah,
Like syntax. So I actually just, if anybody wants to check out my Substack, this is an opportunity for self-promotion. A lot of this stuff is hopefully up and coming I have various papers that I'm going to be submitting for publication. But on my Substack, I've put a whole bunch of these ideas for a while now. And the most recent one was called Syntax is Dead, Long Live Syntax. And the idea behind it is that it's very, it at this point, I believe we can say with a certain degree of finality that the Chomskyan idea of syntax being a distinct kind of mechanism that is overlays and produces and is part of the generative process, but that syntax lives independently of the generative process is no longer a tenable position to hold. Unless you want to propose that humans use a completely different kind of mechanism than large language models, which I think is a kind of almost preposterous position to take, given how good these things are and how computationally efficient they are. Now, we can get into the fact that they need lots and lots of training data, not getting into that right now. Um, but yes, my position is that something like syntax is an emergent from, it's in the corpus, but not explicitly. Meaning those are patterns you will find in the corpus. You can discover them, and it's an interesting question as to why they're there. But you don't ever need, those rules are not instantiated as rules. They're not explicit in the models. Instead, the only thing that's explicit in the models is the topology. It's the relationship, how words, how tokens actually are, in kind of in a graphical sense, relate to other tokens. And this is really very explicitly real in the sense that all that you've got in these models is just vectors. It's just a vectorization. What they're really doing, you have to first the tokenization, and then the next step in these models is to just expand from a dimensional A standpoint to dramatically expand the dimensionality of each token. And so you're going to take a word like cat and you're going to turn it into this hyperdimensional, this very, well, it's not hyperdimensional, but very, very high dimensional vector. But it's just a vector. And every single word in your dictionary, that's really these things ultimately learn a sort of fixed dictionary, ends up being this high dimensional vector. And what that means, if we think about it from in a spatial standpoint, and we're going to be thinking about these things spatially in a few minutes when I show you some of my visualizations, really what that means is every word is simply represented in terms of its, we can think of even spatially about its relation, a spatial relation to all the other words. That is what's in the models. That is the way that words are instantiated. And the way that grammar happens is just has to do with the trajectories through that space. As you're moving around and you're choosing a token, it's a question of where you're going to move in that space. And it's fully determined by the shape of the space. And the relations really, in some sense, drive that, right? Whereas the word and in relation to the previous words I said, where's I don't know, advance or terrain or whatever these other words that are on the screen right now. This is where maybe I should get rid of this slide.
Right. So the vector is a feature representation. Is that correct?
But they really are just token representations. They're not even feature representations, because there are no features independent of the tokens. And that's sort of the wild and crazy thing. And that's to me that was the biggest epiphany, which I haven't fully shared, is that that's all that these models have, which means that the words, they're not decomposable, and they certainly don't point to anything outside of themselves. There is no referent. Like people talk about large language models don't understand what words mean. And I get what they're saying, and they're right, because they don't do anything else. They don't have a visual image. Like when I say to you a cat, right, you immediately maybe pull up an image of a cat. We're going to talk a little bit about that. And that's true, you do that. And large language models don't do that. And so you'd be like, I understand what a cat is. And large language model doesn't. And I will say, yes, it is certainly the case that large language models don't have access to anything like a visual image that a cat could represent. If they don't have any conception of, there's nothing in there that could be called an external reference. It's simply the actual data structure of the relations between, and so it's just these vectors. It's just this big high dimensional space and points in the space. And the knowledge of language in this is where does cat live in that space. And so it's fully abstract. You really can't think of it as anything but as kind of mathematical representation. And so there aren't even really features. But what you do have, of course, are spatial relations. And so cat maybe have close proximity to something like dog. But why does it have that? It's not because they look similar. It's not because they behave similar. The model doesn't know those things about those things. It's because in the process of having to generate language and have to say, I like cats better than dogs. And I know those are fighting words among some people, and it's not true. I like dogs better than cats. But whatever. I just lost half the audience. But whatever. The in making that statement and you understanding that statement and being wanting to fight with me about it and say, well, you're crazy. You know, cats are so much better than dogs, whatever. All of that falls out of the way that we arranged that topology, such that there was the proximity of the token cat and dog leads to that generative behavior. Um, and that's it, right? That's the sort of the long and short and the whole version of what these models actually know about language. They don't know, there's nothing else. So there's no external rules for generation. There's also no external referent. So this in some ways,
Well, the external rules are sort of baked into the corpus that the LLM might be trained on,
yes,
and so like
except
it's
baked in is very different than saying that they are in some ways actually computationally real. They are observable there, but they are not, they're descriptive but not prescriptive, except insofar that it's producing patterns that it's observed in the corpus. Now, one way to tell this story, and a Chomsky would say, well, the way the corpus got that way is because people have those syntactic rules, and then the corpus ends up having those syntactic rules and it learns it. But my claim is, I have a simpler solution for you, which is namely that language itself operates purely based on this kind of predictive structure. And the reason why those rules are there is because that is actually that optimizes and helps in meaningful, useful generation. So the kind of generation that does things like coordinate between people. And so but the sort of Occam's razor approach here is to say, well, there isn't a separate mechanism that we would call syntax or grammar. That is simply a property that is statistically there in the corpus that we humans have constructed. Now, the question of why it's there, interesting question. But we know now for certain that you don't actually have to have any explicit representation of that. There's no generative grammar, right? It doesn't work that way. That's not how these language models work. They don't look for a noun and verb or any of those things. They don't have those rules in any way explicitly encoded. It simply isn't part of it. What are they doing? They're just generating next token, or in the case of diffusion, maybe generating a bunch of next tokens. By the way, I just want to mention autogenerative encompasses diffusion. Again, it's simply the statistical structure, the relation between tokens that gives rise to the ability to diffuse. There isn't anything. There's no syntactic rules, and there are no reference. There's no sense of any world model or anything else that's necessary in order to do this. And that's what I mean by autogenerative. Everything is all it's contained within the body, the structure itself. Even just to hit home a little bit, if we think about cellular automata to think about it is it's a very neat kind of counterexample. You have the state of the world, and then you have a rule, and the rule is not built into the state. The state is one thing, and then the rule is applied on top of it. In the case of language models, and what I'm arguing is the case with language, the rules for generation are actually built in to the corpus itself. It's this incredibly elegant kind of solution where structuring the sort of the graph structure contains within itself the all the rules for generation, including quote unquote grammar, but they're implicit, right? The rules of grammar are sort of implicit in the structure. So that's sort of the key idea behind an autogenerative system. Now, I do want to, right, you need diffusion or you need autoregression. There is a sort of additional process on top of it, which we could quibble about whether that is external or internal to it. But my argument is that all the hard work, all of the fundamentals for language are actually built into the statistics of the corpus. And now we know that for sure. That all you need to do is, I call it just add water, right? You need something that can learn those statistics. And then there are various ways of once it's learned it to get that information out again. But it's in there. It's in the corpus. And
right,
now
right. So
autoregression.
it's like
Sorry,
the
go ahead.
fact that the sky is blue, or it's like a qualitative statement about our universe or our world or Earth basically. Um, and that's baked into the corpus. And so what's drawn out of the corpus is a statistical relationship between the words like the sky and the word blue. Um,
Exactly, exactly. And that's how large language models know that the sky is blue, and they can tell you
and
all about it.
yeah, blind people know that the
They don't
sky
know
is
what blue
blue
is. They don't
also.
know what a sky is, right? And but then, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, blind people who, they don't know, they don't see the sky, but they know that it is blue because they hear people talking about it.
Perfect. Exactly. And that's an early clue that there isn't this grounding isn't really necessary. The fact that blind people can learn visual language and visual words and use them very effectively. They can't generate them spontaneously from the sensory inputs, obviously, but they can, it's kind of like I don't want to get too deep into this, but like the Mary colorblind kind of that famous philosophical problem, right? Somebody who's blind can do vision science, and they can explain what color properties are. They can because they can use all of that terminology appropriately, even though they don't have that quote unquote sensory grounding. And so exactly, I think that points to it
Yeah.
completely.
Yeah. So on Dugan's analogy about blind, so I was just thinking about the idea of information and representation. You've talked about representation, and I wonder where do you draw the line between information and representation of something?
So I
For
am
example, if for the case of blind people, so if are they representing the information they get, or do they have the information, or they are representing it in their neural net or something?
So I consider myself sort of an arch anti-representationalist, in some sense, in that I don't think that it's been helpful from a standpoint of like from cognitive science. I think it's actually been the wrong path to think about symbols as representational in the conventional sense. So I would say that words that what large language models have demonstrated is that language can operate based entirely based on sort of its own internal structure and rule set without representation doing any of the work. There isn't really a sense in which words are representational in the conventional sense. The word, I don't know if you gave an example, but cats and dogs or whatever, or colors like red and blue. The idea that those somehow have some sort of almost metaphysical make contact with some natural kinds, some physical objects in the world is I think a misnomer. It's a mistake to think about these things operating that way. Um, in the case of a blind person, somebody might say, well, they have other notions of what blue means because or sky. Maybe they're using their tactile or auditory kind of grounding. And my argument is like, no, no, that's the wrong way to think about it. Even people who can see, when we say sky and blue, although we get imagery that goes along with that, but when we are talking, we are just playing the language game. We are actually just doing this thing, which these words that have their that operate based on these learned relational structures, and they aren't representational in any deep sense. Now, if you're saying this guy's nuts, what are you talking about? When I say the sky is blue, first of all, I can picture it in my head. Second of all, language does stuff. Language is clearly efficacious. If I say, "Can you grab, that red box for me?" You're going to go and grab the red box. It works. I am not by any means suggesting that the language game that it's played, like the dance of symbols, which is a term I just was using earlier, is purely that has no efficaciousness. It has no efficacy outside of itself. It does have obviously implications for other things. For example, when I say the word red to you, your visual system may pop up if you're unless you're aphantasic, it may pop up an image of redness. And that is a distinct non-linguistic thing that's happening. And so there's a coupling that's clearly there between language and non-linguistic structures. And it goes both ways. When you see something, when your sensory system sees something red, the word red may occur to you. And one way to think about that, it might prompt your linguistic system to now say, I see something red. But the point is that the linguistic system operates entirely based on the rules of language with some message passing happening from both to and from it. So it's kind of like prompt injection. We can think of it that way. Like it's like if you were to say to ChatGPT, there's a red object on a desk and a blue object. If I say to you, go get the red object, what are you going to do? And it will say, well, I'll pick up the red object. It knows what to do linguistically based on the fact that you've told it something that it could have learned, right? In theory, you could have a camera attached that would say, and then you could convert that into some form that they can get turned into the linguistic stream. And so then it would say, okay, there's a red object here. In fact, the multimodal models do exactly that. When you take a picture and you show it to GPT, it can describe that picture. But what's really happening there is that it's been trained to take these some compressed version of the visual and turn it into the kinds of vectors that can get embedded into the linguistic stream. It's not actually making contact at all with the actual visual representation. So I would say that I'm arguing against any sort of representational scheme at all in the case of language. And even the blind person is using language the same way we are when they're talking about the blue sky, because they're just using the language game just the same way we are. It's just in their case they don't have maybe the auxiliary component of this extra thing that happens, namely like an activation of visual blue when they think about the sky. We do. But when we're using the words, we're actually using them exactly the same way. Dugan, thank you. I should use that more often. It's really a very effective way of sort of getting at the thing that the blue means the same thing for the blind person as it does for the seeing person within language. And because LLMs are effectively blind and deaf and non-tactile, they don't have any of the sensory modalities, but they're doing the language thing.
Yeah, yeah. I'm
If that
trying to
answers the
think of
question.
like things that we have no perception of, like radio waves. We don't see them, we don't feel them, but we know that they're there. We know people describe them, use instrumentation to like access them, but it's like outside the realm of our like perceptual system.
Yeah. And could we imagine what it would mean? And it sort of gets to this point, like over the course of the development and evolution of language, it was designed, the topology, this internal topology was designed in such a way that it ends up being effective and coupled with the sensory system. And so if we had the capacity to sense radio waves, and if we'd had them for hundreds of thousands, millions of years, then we probably would have developed linguistic ways of interacting with them, but not really describing them, right? The word red doesn't really mean, by the way, this is that the original epiphany that sort of led to all this kind of this whole rabbit hole is that it's the age-old problem of inversion, of red-green inversion. It's that the word red doesn't tell you anything about the quality of the color, right? That's why my red could be your green, because the word red just doesn't do that. What does the word red do? It says that when we're both pointing to something, we're both going to call that red. And so it's causally, behaviorally, coordinatively effective to do that. But it doesn't mean red. It just doesn't. It's like it's actually sort of fundamentally observable that red doesn't mean red. And then it's not hard to go from there and say, oh, well, that's how the large language models can still talk about red, because language doesn't really do that thing. It doesn't depend on that thing, that redness. In fact, that's a completely separate dichotomous system. So if we had radio waves that we had to interact with, we would probably have words for those things. But similar to the way actual visible color works, those words would just be ways to coordinate around it. They wouldn't actually capture something fundamental about those radio waves. It would just be ways of gesturing and pointing and agreeing and things like that we do with color terms.
Yeah. Roy Dobson on chat is saying that knowing is the artificial connection that we imagine between language and experience. It's an illusion.
Yes,
What do you think
Roy
about that?
is commented on a couple of certainly on a bunch of my Substack pieces as well. And I think he was an early adopter to this idea that there is there's a bit of an illusion, something of an illusion that knowledge is this sacrosanct idea, sort of in the scientific Western conception. But what if it's just a linguistic construct, and that it isn't as fundamental as we think? It's not something I was going to get into in today's talk, but it is something I actually have a talk on YouTube. People might want to check out, whose problem is the mind-body problem, which does get into this, when we think about knowledge, well, and it's sort of like the Mary problem, knowing what red is and what the red experience is off limits to language. Language, it simply doesn't make contact with that kind of computational process. And there's some sense in which language is deaf, dumb, and blind. It doesn't understand the world in the way that our sort of animal sensory processing system does. So it's a great
it's
point.
interesting. Like I know about electrons not because I've experienced them, but because I've read other people write about them. Scientists, you know.
Yes, exactly. And that's
So I have no
that right.
direct
I mean,
experience with it, or I've never you know,
and that's sort of the whole game is, and you think, so the question is, all of objective language, thing we talk about forces and objects and properties and all of these things, and um, that is the lingua franca of scientific discourse and frankly how we and also colloquial coordinative language, but is is that fundamental, or is it just the way we human organisms can kind of do stuff and very important stuff? Science. This is not an anti-science kind of perspective. It's what it really is that there are different kinds of foundational systems, and language is one of them. But it may be orthogonal or kind of in some ways metaphysically distinct from other ones, or at least computationally distinct. Let's not say metaphysical because we don't want to wade too far into that. But yes, that's sort of the essence of it. Dugan is that using those words may just be using the words. But again, we shouldn't. I don't want to shortchange words and how effective they are. We, as a civilization, we can coordinate and do all kinds of amazing stuff with language that non-linguistic uh, organisms cannot do. It is absurdly powerful in terms of sort of behavioral coordination and probably even for internal kind of reasoning about the future and things like that, things that we can encode linguistically. We can think about stuff, but it doesn't mean that we're doing what we think we're doing. When we think about stuff, we may just be running the LLM, not really actually thinking about it in this way that makes contact with the other kinds of ways of knowing. Cool. All right. I haven't even gotten to the second bullet exactly, but so the autoregression, and this is I got to dive into this. How much time we got? Are we really ending at 3?
yeah, we can go on.
Okay. Didn't realize what time. Okay. So here's the thing I really wanted to talk about with you guys in particular. So the autoregression piece. And so what's going on in autoregression is that there's a structure, the autogenerative structure that the topology contains within itself the right ingredients for generation. And we do it autoregressively. We say, given where we've been, given the sequence so far, what should be the next token? And then we tack that on to the sequence and we do it again and again. And it's recursive, which is really cool. And that's an important part, but it's not the main point I want to talk about. The main thing I want to talk about is that the walk across the terrain is guided by memory. That what's inherent to the autoregressive process is these trajectories through the token space. When you're talking, when a large language model is talking, it's taking steps and it's saying, what should I say next? And it's doing that based on what's come before. So it's inherently non-Markovian in that it doesn't just matter where you are. It's not what your current state is. Your current state has to take into account the previous steps, how you got here. So you're leaving this breadcrumb trail as you go along linguistically, everything we talked about today, right? Like this whole conversation, including the last few words I say, but also everything else we talked about, is that breadcrumb trail. And the next generation, the next thing, the word I'm going to say next, or if I asked you, Dugan, what do you think about this? Right? The words that you're going to say are contingent on the sequence that came before. And that's what is kind of mind-blowingly, profoundly elegant about the autogenerative system of language is that the topology contains within it, by virtue of the relations between these tokens, it has paths built in that if I've been on this path up to this point, then then the paths that branch off of that are directed by what's come before. And so this sort of built in both history and then future is something I call the pregnant present. And it's nice and alliterative, but it sort of captures the basic idea is that in the process of choosing the very next word, what you're doing two things. You're taking into account all the sequence that came up till now, and you're also not just choosing a next word, but you're choosing a path. You're choosing a next path because the history actually is predicting the likely not one path but multiple possible paths that that could come later. And so this is how large language models achieve this high degree of coherence, even though they're doing next token. When I first heard, I still remember. I remember where I was. It's like one of those like late flashbulb memories when I first learned that large language models. I remember I wasn't a language guy. People who do language maybe knew all about autoregression and maybe, but until large language models really dropped in words, I had never heard about this next token prediction thing, and I was like, that can't be right. I've been using these things. They're surely not just guessing next word because they clearly have in mind what they're going to say later because they're like, well, there's three, I have three. There's three reasons for for in response to your question. I have three possible answers. Well, and then it lists the three. Well, how does it say that if it's just doing next token? It's clearly thinking into the future. So this is the key. The key is that there are the shape of the space, the topology of the space has these trajectories. These are actually carved out into it. When it's constructed, when it's learning to do next token, it's actually learning far more than just to take the next step. It's learning the sort of the gullies and the ridges, and it's not learning them. It's forming the gullies and the ridges such that if you take something and push it in this direction, it's going to tend to go down this path or that path. Now, it's not deterministic in the sense that you can add some noise and you can maybe end up going down this direction, but maybe kicked out and go in a slightly different direction. That's what gives these large language models their expressive capacity. They don't always say the same thing. You add some noise. It's called temperature. You raise the temperature, they're not just going to pick the very most likely one. They may choose the second most likely. And by choosing that, though, the point is when it's choosing that, it's not just choosing the next token, it's choosing the next path. And so this is the inherent non-Markovian nature of these systems that they have to take into account during not only during inference, but when they're learning, they are learning these sequential paths through this space. And in order to do that, you have to have memory. You can't front load everything into the most previous state. You have to say, I'm encoding the previous states and the sequence of those previous states. Now, you can cheat and always say, well, that's your most recent state. But then you've lost all of the elegance of what the purpose of a Markovian system is, right? You're not supposed to have to remember everything that happened to now and front load, and force that into the current state. Otherwise, there's no point in being Markovian. The point of Markovian is like you're supposed to actually know all you need is to know where you are in order to know where you're going to go. My contention is that these models demonstrate that at least in the case of language, and I'm going to argue, and briefly, don't worry, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but in other natural computational systems, I believe that is insufficient, that you cannot ever get away with the kind of computational richness that you need in order to do this forward kind of projection. In order to be able to plan out a coherent future, you need to be able to take into account and to learn these kinds of trajectories through the space not just take into account your current position, right? If I could just airdrop you into the location and you could figure out where to go from there, that's Markovian. If you have to know, well, how did I get here to this position in order to take the next step, that's non-Markovian. And my argument is that these systems are fundamentally not Markovian, and that other systems are not Markovian or can't will ultimately be proven, and it's kind of a conjecture, but the computation will have to be non-Markovian. That you're gonna have to think about building in some form of memory. In the case of human memory, that's probably not like exactly like the large language models, because in the large language models, there really is, in some ways, all of the information that's contained. Every token you've produced until now is actually being pretty much precisely represented in terms of the next generation. If I ask you, Dugan, what did I say 3 sentences ago? My guess is you don't have a clue, right? What exactly was the talk? Maybe you don't even have a general idea. But here you are. We're in the flow. You're riding. You're surfing this conversation, and in some sense, you do know. You're following the flow of the conversation, even though you can't explicitly recall. Now, it could be that our brain actually is literally representing everything we've said until now, and it could potentially be fully extractable, but we just can't retrieve it. We can't recover it like explicitly. But more likely is that our brain is actually compressing stuff as we go along, and what we're doing is we're building this more economical representation of the recent and even not so recent past that is informing and guiding our next token generation. In the large language models, by the way, if you really dig into them, they encode the entire sequence in a kind of funny way. It's not exactly the way we think about it. It's not like they don't actually have to churn through like when you're having a really long conversation with the large language models, they're not actually feeding in the whole conversation again and again, and then reprocessing because there's all this extra stuff you have to do every time you get a token and you have to compare it to all the other tokens. You don't want to have to do that. You cache that. You say, how are all these tokens up till now all related to one another? And you cache that and you just pull out that cache. What you're really doing is that last token is actually loaded with the combination of all of the relations between all the other words, but they're all in there. It's this beautiful abstract kind of representation
The
of all the
themes are in
tokens.
there. Like I've been recording like the audio in my mind. I've been recording the video of you talking to me in my mind, but I have been keeping track of the themes that you're talking about. You're talking about, oh, you have this prompt, you have to make the next one, you have to have like a memory of what's been said before, and
You're doing,
like
you're doing this.
and you
You're
have
doing this like
a
yeah. Go
plan
go. Sorry.
for like where you go, a trajectory, like you said, and you have to have enough like working memory to do that. And
Yes. But I actually it's a different conversation. I think like what you're doing when you're thinking back is actually sort of a meta process that's not really representative. I think the brain probably has a lot more than that. That's you trying to pull it out and turn it into some sort of form that you can express. But I think there's something much subtler happening that isn't captured. I think the whole working memory literature kind of I'm going to say it kind of got it wrong because we're asking people to do explicitly recover as opposed to saying what's guiding your conversation, your generation. I think there's much more actually present in memory than you can explicitly recover. So, we kind of could do shorthand stuff like, well, we talked about this, we talked about that, and that's a way of doing like if I want to communicate to you, and we can explicitly recover that stuff, but it's probably a much more it's much lower fidelity than probably what our brain actually has access to in terms of continuing this conversation. So I fall somewhere in between. It's probably not the full representation that large language models do, but it probably is something better, a lot better than repeat back the last 5 words, which 5 to 7 words or something like you could do. That's ridiculously compressed, and I think that's just not really representative of almost anything real. And then the thing that you talked about, which is like you could kind of piece together, maybe that's a somewhat better, but it's probably even that is probably not quite capturing it, if that makes sense. Um, but in any case, you need memory, right? And you need this kind of and you not only need memory, but you need to think about computation and in this
Can you
not
share
sharing
your
this.
screen instead of the window?
Sorry, I have to share that one. Here we go. Okay, now you can
Okay.
see this, hopefully.
Okay.
And
So
by the way, I was
it's a diffusion model or something.
no, so this is really it's just a little toy model of little particles that are rolling around based on either a purely where am I now and what is the shape of the surface? So I can just change out the surface.
I see.
So maybe roll down a hill or up, depending on where it has a certain degree of momentum. Um, and there's I have two different kind of models running here. One is autoregressive, you can't really read it, and one is Markovian. And so what that means is the Markovian one is not going to take the trajectory into consideration when in terms of choosing the next step. It's simply going to say, where am I? And based on where I am and the local landscape, I'm going to take the next step. And the autoregressive one is taking trajectory into account. So let's reset these. And what you'll see over and over again is the Markovian one will eventually just get into a local minimum and it'll get stuck. And the autoregressive one, because it's trying to map out a uh, a smooth trajectory based on its path history, isn't getting stuck because that actually produces a certain kind of momentum. It says, based on not just where I am now, but based on where I've been up to this point, this is the direction I should go in. And in this particular little thing I built, you can change things like history poll. So this is how much is the past influencing its current direction. And so if I get rid of it, then what you'll see is they'll basically turn into the same thing. And so it will also get stuck. So there's the Markovian one is red, autoregressive is in blue. But if we give it, context, let's raise the context strength, raise the trail length a little bit. It won't get out now. It's already stuck as it because it has no history anymore. Its recent history is just where it's been, right? And so that's not informative. It doesn't actually tell us anything about where it should go. There's no definition now of a smooth path. But if we reset the agent, and now it should start
So the
moving around.
the,
There you go.
the
That's the blue
regressive
down
one,
there.
the blue one, with a
Yes,
history
the
in mind,
autoregressive.
I guess it looks like it's trying to keep its momentum. Like the
Yeah,
momentum
it's
that
such
it's
that
built
it's
up,
trying to keep
it's
the
like,
momentum, but it's also trying to keep it's actually keeps kind of smooth angular momentum.
yeah.
So it'll carve out a smooth trajectory. No, it's why is it moving so slow? What's it doing? Too many knobs.
A lot of knobs here.
This is why we need optimization, why we need AI, and we need backprop is to do this kind of
Hmm.
optimization. Let's see if I and raise the context strength a bit. Add some momentum. Well, it's not doing the nice thing anymore. Oh, history, because I got rid of the history poll.
Oh
Okay,
yeah.
here we go. Ta-da. Okay. Yeah, so it does get stuck if you don't have that history. But you can see it. It'll kind of go straight until now. Obviously, I forced it to not
Oh,
go through the wall. So it's kind of just, but it's just trying to keep a smooth trajectory. And so that kind of smooth trajectory is what I is meant. Now this is a very simple surface, obviously. But if we think about a hyperdimensional surface, namely the token space, and you have to traverse that, the idea is that keeping a quote unquote smooth trajectory is maintaining the paths that when that space, so when the large language models form that space out of all of the tokens that they've learned, and they build the high dimensional space, they're doing it in such a way that smoothness through that space is going to favor the appropriate next token generation. That's so that's sort of the again. So that I sort of said this earlier. It's not just about having memory. It's about the entire structure of how you represent the knowledge. In the case, at least in the case of large language models, and I argue in the case of human language, certainly, what you're doing is actually constructing the data structure such that sequences through that space are going to be going to be functional. You want to get the right sequence. You want to get the right trajectories that end up doing the thing that you want to do. Now, the thing you want to do, of course, is to coordinate behavior, is to do meaningful stuff with language. And I haven't said anything, and frankly, I haven't made much headway yet in my thinking about all this as to how that actually works. Like, how does that lead you to being able to say things like, please, grab me that box and put it on top of the table, and then you're able to do that. But the language models show that it is possible, that just by shaping that space and having to be able to do accurate prediction, that is sufficient to be able to produce not just any old next token, but the functional next token. And it's not just, and it's an important point, it's not just like predicting. Predicting is the wrong word. It's not like that's the one it saw before. Large language models can talk about things that they've never encountered before. It's the next functional generation. It's the thing that is so when you're building the space, you're building the space in such a way that it's going to be useful, not just predictive, but useful in terms of the next token generation. And so how that works and how that all coordinates with the perceptual system, the memory system, obviously is the work in my, if you agree with me, if you think that this is a framework that makes sense, then that's the work that computational linguistics really needs to do. It's kind of a new game. It's like, how does this thing actually function, given that it is autogenerative, given that it's about the internal structure, and that learning that structure is what gives it its functionality. How on earth does that work? But I think it's in my opinion, and I'm being cute here, it's a step in the right direction, right? It's that next step, but it's a step in the right direction, right? It's all about where we're going to carve out the right path here. So, at a meta level. Okay, that's what I have to say about language. Oh, I did want to show you this. So I actually built a little toy model also that to compare Markovian or autoregressive in a very small kind of computational universe of words. It doesn't work great, but let's just see it go. And so what this means is, in this case, it's actually taken into account, this actually has a little mini attention system, so self-attention. And that's a piece I haven't really gotten to talk about much in this conversation. It's not only about the topology of the space. That's sort of the static autogenerative structure. In the process of generating, you're also doing self-attention, which means you're taking into account all the other tokens that have come along and their locations in the space, and you're using that in order to guess next token. What this means, by the way, is you don't just really get the visualization I showed you isn't really accurate, because when you're working through the token space, you don't really just move smoothly like that. You can kind of teleport, and you can go make big jumps to other locations because you've packed in all of the other tokens. There's a bunch of other tokens, like for example, if you have words like and the, those kinds of words, those are going to show up not because they're semantically close by in the space or anything like that, but they're just the appropriate thing to go. And sometimes you're just going to jump to those and then jump back out. So there really isn't very neat way to kind of visualize that kind of teleporting. But all of that is still built in to how you want to shape your space. So I'm not backing down on that, but I'm backing down on the ease of visualizing this stuff. But in this case,
so you have the color coding, the groupings are like different parts of speech, like
yeah. So these are
nouns,
sort of
verbs,
these are sort of
connections.
a little bit like semantic clusters.
Uh-huh.
I'm having trouble reading them
Verbs
because
are
I need more.
green, blue is noun, yeah. And I guess, is there directionality to these arrows? Like I wouldn't.
So you're going to see. So watch. I'm going to play it.
Mm-hmm.
So here we're doing. So what it's doing at each point, so it's going to make a jump, and then it's going to say, what are the conditional probabilities? Given that I'm here, in the Markovian sense, it's going to say from here, just one back. Given that I'm here, what are the probabilities? And all of this is pretty much fake data, but not totally fake data. I did actually use conditional probabilities to build this thing, it's like from like ngram stuff. Like you can get the conditional probabilities if from the word what's probability of these various words. You compute those, and then you make the jump. If you add some temperature, you maybe make you could make the next, not the next, the most likely, but the next most likely, whatever. We can put the temperature down to 0, in which case it's always going to pick the most likely. But yes, in the Markovian sense, it's starting from a point and it's saying, okay, what are the probabilities of all of these? It's computing those and saying, I'm going to jump to the next one, and then it's going to do it again. And so it's just walking through this space. So we can watch this go, and then you can see over here you could see a mouse on fox sees behind. And so what's happening here is, and I don't even know how rabbit is behind rabbit. This again, it's a small world. These aren't probably particularly representative of anything. They're real conditional probabilities, but it's a very small set of words. But as you can see, this is not coherent. A mouse on fox sees behind rabbit chases, and that's because even if the pairwise conditional probabilities are accurate, it doesn't care about, right, this when it goes from sees to behind, it's not thinking about fox. I mean, maybe if you had fox sees, then you say a fox sees a rabbit or something like that. But if you just see sees, maybe you say sees behind. And so this is just to show in a very simplistic form uh, the fundamental limits of conditional probabilities, and that ngram approaches basically did conditional probabilities for a whole bunch of years. They didn't just do one back; they did maybe 50 back, 100 back, or something like that. But it doesn't work. It's not sufficient. You're never going to get full language from that because you need to have two things. One is you have to be able to go flexibly many back, more than 100, 1,000 or whatever back. And you also, and this is really key, the ngram kind of models, the conditional probabilities are still just, they're never learning what a smooth trajectory looks like through that. They're just learning sort of in the hierarchical sense, conditional, unconditional, unconditional. They're just learning these hierarchical conditional probabilities, but they're not actually learning these smooth probabilities. In an autoregressive model, you get something, let me reset it. And now it's doing these conditional probabilities, but it's taking into account the history. A rabbit sees. Not the best. It keeps doing this. I don't know why. It wants to terminate early. So something about these probabilities, but they're at least sort of grammatical. A rabbit sees. That makes sense. A rabbit does see. It doesn't tell you what it sees, but it's something that a rabbit can do. Let's see
It's
what
a it's a very cool visualization that helps with the intuitions
Thank
breaking
you.
a little
Yes,
bit.
that's what
Yeah,
I was
for
going
sure.
for. Defense on. Oh gosh,
I'll
that's
I'll keep watching the rest of
that's
the
it
recording
all.
later.
So much for live demos. Um,
All right.
but
See you,
yes,
James.
I hope that this sort of just gets the core idea across. I've been trying to come up with a visualization. The prior one is in some ways a little too simplistic because it doesn't take into account really any sort of conditional probability, but at least it gets this idea of a smooth trajectory and that the history can matter. But in this case, it's sort of semantically jumping, right? It's like saying I'm going to go get a conjunction word or something like that, which isn't going to show up in the visualized spaces being nearby.
Yeah,
That's where you have to
so
tell.
I
I don't know
would.
how to visualize this thing. Dugan, help me. You're the visualization.
Right. So it's interesting. I mean, are these a lot of times these would be directed arrows for one. So like the jump between the on and the comma shouldn't be there. Like, and from the connections, the prepositions, the orange dots, there shouldn't be a line going from the red dots to the orange dots. Articles to prepositional phrases. Right? It's like, so yeah,
So how
directionality
would you
is,
so first of all, arrows, directional arrows, yeah, that would be very helpful.
yeah.
Uh, Maybe they should be almost like I can imagine a kind of color gradient, like going from directional
Oh,
color
just
gradient or
like
something.
arrowheads, I guess. But
Yeah, I
I
can
mean,
just do arrowheads. I'm trying to be
but I'm
fancy.
wondering, like in the representation of this graph, is it directed arrows or is it bidirected?
Oh, great question. The answer is bidirected. And how do I know that? Because in an early version of this, I would get stuck, and it would just keep bouncing back between
Mm,
two words. And so it was going both directions. So you're right. They are bidirectional. I think what I did was I put in a bias to not go back to where you came from, so that it didn't get stuck in those loops.
right,
Um,
right. I mean, so you could encode some of the syntax for English in the directionality of those arrows. For instance, an adjective comes before like the noun that it's qualifying in our
right.
language. In some other
Yes,
languages, it's different.
you'd certainly, but that should fall out in some sense. That's what you really want here is to be able to do this visualization on a real embedding space, with attention, so that you can actually see those kinds of those regularities show up while watching it go.
Yeah,
So that's the dream, and I'm gonna do it. This was all just really to sort of build up what's kind of an intuitive visualization.
yeah.
So given that it's bidirectional though, so we're not gonna have the arrowheads. Um, what we want to maybe you could do like a loop, like you could do this, right? You could do show the arrow this way for that one, and then arrow curved out that way for the other way, if, in case it's going, the other
In
direction
case there is a loop back, but yeah,
in case there is a loop. And there are certainly times when I'm sure we can come up with lots of examples, not off the top of our head, where you end up getting at least a little bit of a loop sometimes. I don't know why I can't think of any right now, but yes. But then how do you ever get out of the loop? The answer is Markovian, you'll never get out of the loop, right? That's one way to think about why those things were getting stuck in the earlier visualization. If each one is like the other's BFF, right? I like this guy and this guy likes this guy, and they're just gonna keep going. But if you have a sequence that tells you, well, until now there was this going on, even then, even though it may make sense to go one time out and one time back, but the entire sequence may be voting to now get out of there, and so you can break out of those shallow attractors, because the rest of the sequence is voting too. It's not just sort of the super local vote.
yeah. I mean, yeah. So that's why attention or memory is really important. So you can remember where you've been and not and have a rule saying avoid loops.
Yes, exactly. Avoid loops means you're in a loop.
Hmm.
And it doesn't have to be explicit like that. It doesn't have to be like check whether I'm in a loop. In the case of these kind of longer trajectories, it could just be that the path itself disfavors that loop, because that's not the kind of path that has sort of been reinforced before. Even if it could have a little local loop, but in the grander scheme of things, it's going to get outvoted. The sort of local minimum is going to get outvoted by the longer trajectory. It's like like a river. There could be a little local kind of a ditch, and then the water will pool there a bit, but then the river's going to keep it going. The larger current of the river is going to move keep the process moving forward, even if you have that that little local minimum. These are all nice sort of metaphors, um, but the goal here is hopefully not only to do visualization, but to actually do something a little bit more functionally useful, not just to us. It's useful for us as humans to understand it, but to be able to say something more meaningful about these trajectories, and that could actually have very broad implications for thinking about how to build these models, because the way we do it now is really just it's very top. It's just entirely bottom-up data driven. But maybe there are regularities in the kinds of structures that end up in these topologies that may be useful to know about. If we knew something global, right? There's this global kind of topology. There's certain kinds it's got a geographic kind of structures and forms that probably recur in lots of different places across the surface. And maybe that'd be helpful to know. Maybe we could do a certain kind of almost geology of these things so that could help us to understand them and to build better ones. And then, of course, in relation to human cognition, there may be there may be nameable, meaningful kinds of tendencies. We heard biases and heuristics and those kinds of things that have been observed in behavior, but perhaps they fall out of these kinds of topological structures. And so if we could have a way of characterizing and understanding these things mathematically, that might be helpful in lots of different ways. So that certainly amongst my future goals is to really expand this beyond these kind of toy models. Okay. If I have just a few more moments, I appreciate those who are
Keep going.
sticking
Yeah,
around.
you're good.
Okay, great. Are you seeing, you're not seeing my slides now, right? Because I have to share those again. So let me stop sharing
Yeah.
and share. I still don't, it's been how many years since COVID and I'm still not that good at this. Okay, back to these. Okay. So I sort of have just cartoon versions uh, of some possible extensions of this way of thinking. And I'm not an expert in these subfields, and so those of you who know more than I do, feel free to attack or dismiss as you see fit, or if you feel like maybe I'm onto something, but there's a better way to say it. But there seem to be some good candidates. Well, let me just back up for 1 second. Right, the idea is that okay, the language seems to work this way, at least in large language models. I'm arguing that it works this way. Language works this way in people, in humans, and then the next conjecture. So there's sort of a four-stage conjecture. The first one I don't even think is a conjecture. I think it's clear that language itself is autogenerative. Um, Whether autoregression is exactly the way to do it, maybe that's the conjecture, is that that's the right way to do language in computationally. So first conjecture is, or we call the second conjecture is humans do it that way too. Um, Third conjecture is that it's not just language, but that our minds do other kinds of autoregressive processing. So think visual imagery, for example. These video models are really good, and they work primarily. They work on something like autoregression. They do it sequentially. They say, given the sequence of frames until now, what's the next one? Maybe our visual imagery works that way. Motor planning, things like that. So I've got a whole paper that I've been putting together on the evidence for in the linguistic case. Also has non-linguistic cognition. And so that's the third conjecture, if we're keeping track. And then the fourth conjecture is that this may be a principle that applies to other systems besides cognition. I think it almost certainly applies to other things besides language, because I doubt that language had to build this whole computational infrastructure on its own. That humans evolved language or developed language, however the heck language showed up, and had to build this entire autoregressive or topological predictive system from scratch. It seems more likely that the brain already was probably doing this kind of thing in other contexts, and that other species probably do something similar, and then language got glommed onto that. Um, that's the third. That's the third conjecture that it goes beyond language to other forms of cognition. Fourth conjecture is that it goes beyond cognition. That autoregression is probably something that shows up in other systems. So here's one: epigenetic regulation. The idea is that you've got the genome, right? And that's sort of the static structure. And then you've got right. So going back to like autogenerative versus autoregressive, you've got the genome, then the epigenome. The epigenome is like, well, once the genome is embedded in certain environments, and then it does stuff, but that doing stuff is encoded now. It's not only like let's make let's start producing certain proteins, but it's the reason it's an epigenome is because now you've rewritten to some extent the genetic code. And so you're doing this based on a static structure, but then over time you're building sequentially building up over history that potentially, and again, I don't know enough about this stuff to speak very knowledgeably about it, but it seems like this rhymes with autoregression in some ways, is that you have these sequential processes where what you've done until now is going to guide what you're doing next, and that the history actually matters. It's not Markovian. It's not that you just think about current state. It's that there may even be a kind of encoding of the history until now, chemical signals, stress events, whatever, that are actually determining what the next state is. Namely, what proteins you should express now are dependent not just on the current state, but on previous states. The immune system. I don't know if Will Hahn is on this call, but it's something that he and I have been thinking about for quite a long time, is the immune system. And the immune system learns. How does it learn? How does it build up? How does it change over time? Perhaps it's doing something similar where it's building up this cumulative history, past exposures. It has to know this is not harmful. Autoimmune disease is when, or like an allergy is when it hasn't effectively learned that this is something that it shouldn't respond to, but it has to learn a pathogen is something it should respond to, and now is ready to respond in the future. And so it's changing over time. Potentially, it's doing that in this history-dependent kind of way.
Right. And it compresses like a virus comes in and then like it attacks it and then it keeps like a piece of it or some proteins from it
Yes.
or some genetic material from it so that it as an antibody, right? So it can store that, and then when something new comes along, that antibody might be expressed and then proliferated, and then something like that. I forget how it works exactly, but there's a compression.
Yeah, and again, I don't want to step too deeply into these waters, but I suspect, and I've reached out. There was a biologist who wrote something. There was a great Substack piece about something that really reminded me of this, and I reached out to him, and he never responded. I was sad, but I feel like there is almost certainly sort of fertile ground for thinking about these things in this kind of trajectory, retaining the sequence historically kind of way in these other domains. Um, but how do you build a body out of the stem cells? This kind of thing. Is it that it just takes into does the system as a whole just is it Markovian? Like this is right now I'm if you think about an individual cell, it's looking at its local environment, but that local environment was determined by what had happened to the other cells that are in its local environment. This whole thing is unfolding over time. It seems like a very ripe possible kind of ground for this kind of autoregressive trajectory kind of plotting rather than just thinking about state action. It's something like an unfolding of kind of like a flight path or something like that, a trajectory through kind of cell space, like what kind of cell you should be, is not just dependent on your local environment. Where if it is, we have to think about the entire system, like what kind of cells should I make now, right? That's kind of like autoregression in the large language models. It's the entire sequence is voting what should the next token be. Similarly, so the entire system is gonna by during the course of development is voting on what kind of cell should I make next. And that cell is going to determine what the next cell should be. So again, it kind of rhymes with autoregression.
Yeah. I mean, it's like you have the first cell, and it doesn't decide what it's going to do next. It like makes a copy of itself and tells that what to do, and has instructions for how to kick that down the chain, right?
Yeah, except but it doesn't. But if it just made a pure copy, then we'd all just be amorphous blobs of right. And so the cells get differentiated. Their liver cells are different than heart cells and all of that. And how they do that is still, I think, pretty poorly understood. But there seems to be a plan, right? And how does that plan happen? Does it just kind of happen organically based on sort of local attractors in somehow in the phase of development, like it's just built in, or is there something closer to regression where like the macro system is voting in some ways. I'm speaking in such vague terms that it may not have that much utility. But yes, there's a sort of core question of like you go from copying to differentiation, and you do it in a systematic way that ends up building a body. And it seems to me again like it has some autoregressive kinds of features that you have kind of repeated processes, just like you have next token, and then voting where the history of the sequence determines what you do next, and that proper generation is when you're properly plotting a course through that kind of trajectory. Okay, and that's all I got. That is my discussion. I did want to briefly mention physics, and I'm really, I'm out of my wheelhouse here, and
Yeah.
I can't finish even saying it. But the real quick point I want to make is that, no big deal, but calculus was a cheat. The calculus, by doing this kind of infinitesimally small, what it's doing is it's getting rid of history, and it's saying you have this thing called momentum, but momentum is built in to just the infinitesimally small moment. It's right there. But momentum really is what happened in the recent past. It's like how have you been moving through space? Not that you have instantaneous, right? It's always confusing when you first learn about it. Instantaneous, like velocity is but velocity doesn't make any sense instantaneously. That's not really meaningful. And the answer is no, it's not. It's a mathematical trick, and that maybe the physical universe is much closer to autoregression in that there really is a memory. The reason why a particle moves from here to there is not because it has some instantaneous feature of force or velocity, but instead it's because the universe remembers, right? Pepperidge Farm remembers, and so does the universe. It remembers where that particle was in the past, and that is what is determining where it's going to go in the future. So the idea that sort of nature has memory in this sense, I think potentially is a very, very different way of thinking. It's not entirely my own. Since I've been exploring this, I've encountered there are those who have pushed back against, have different frameworks that are non-Markovian for thinking about physics. And so again, it just seems like computationally, this is a pretty different way of characterizing lots of different stuff. That's sort of the broader message here, as inelegant as I put it.
Hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. So it's like there could be a couple, microseconds of state that's like keeps pushing the universe forward.
Exactly. And in some ways, that makes at least as much sense as saying your denominator goes to infinity. Like, I don't know. I guess,
From zero, yeah.
it's like it's just yeah, well, sorry, right, exactly. Infinitesimal,
Yeah.
infinitesimal. That's it's true the math works out and it does good prediction, but is that the way the universe works? Probably not, right? It's like it seems like actually like there's time and movement through time, and it's not actually all actually compressed into the most recent moment.
I like that. I like that thought. So there's a little bit
Oh,
of
I'm glad I
context
mentioned it
with
'cause
a little
yeah,
bit of
I'd almost
context in there.
forgotten. Yeah, and I don't know to what extent this may contact with sort of the Wolfram universe and thinking about physics. But the Wolfram, this at least cellular automata, I know you guys just told me recently that there's some that maybe go two back or something like that. In the rules may actually take into account previous states. The question is how far back do you have to go in order to capture certain basic properties of physics in cellular automata? And I don't know enough about how you've captured physics in general in these systems. And I'd love to learn more about that because for me, it seems like a very good test bed for sort of pushing back against my autoregressive idea and say, well, how much mileage can you get just out of current state and simple rule? So
Yeah, I mean,
I
there's
think that,
cellular automata. Like you can expand the definition of cellular automata. There are cellular automata that have history built into, what they're doing next. that kind of look back a couple steps.
Yeah, that's what
So
you mentioned last time. I was checking that out. A couple of steps, may be sufficient for getting a lot of stuff. And the question is where does it break? Um, what systems need language? I think we could safely say needs a lot more than just a few steps back. Um, but it's an open question as to what other systems need what kind of memory in order to function. And then really, the fundamental question is like physics itself, like is there literally some sense in which we could say this far back, this is how far back physics goes in determining the next state? Like, is that a meaningful question? I really would love to hear from like a foundations of physics kind of person, um, to kind of weigh in on that. Because you can get, just one step back, I guess that's enough to get velocity. But if you want to get, what do you need in order to get, which, second derivative, third derivative, right? You need to go back further, and how much of physics depends on those further derivatives, in order to be able to say what your rate of change is. And again, the
yeah,
physics doesn't
right.
do it
And
this
yeah,
way.
like does it make sense that physics would keep track of second or third derivatives?
I don't know. Or maybe physics keeps track of all of it, and right, everything is since the Big Bang. Maybe it's all in there. Like once you open up the possibility that the past reaches into the present, then maybe it's doing it all the time. I had this wacky idea that like non-locality and things like that maybe have something to do. Maybe they're pointing to this, that the fact that things originated at a common point means that past is still impacting the two of them, so that they're, what happens here is still impacting this because they share this past. Very vague stuff. Foundations. I mean, quantum mechanics is weird anyway, so I could throw out my own weird ideas, and go ahead and sue me. Spooky action at a distance is already spooky. But I think it's interesting to think about what if you relax the sort of common the typical notions we have of the past is the past, and what's happening now is completely contingent on now. Um, who says? Who says? Right?
Yeah,
Maybe the
it's
physical.
interesting mathematically. Michael Ostroff on chat is kind of pointing out that a smoothly continuous function, um, a smooth function does have all the derivatives defined like at every instant.
It has all the
But
derivatives, but you don't need to compute them in
and
order to maintain
but
smoothness.
what you would need to define those derivatives at an instant is sort of at least some smooth some continuous segment behind that, and it could be infinitesimally small, but you'd still need some sort of history.
Yes. Yes. And so in some ways, this is just really pushing back against the idea of the infinitesimally small as being a hack, rather than just embracing the fact that no, you need the actual past.
Mm-hmm.
Like there is no such thing as infinitesimally small. Like no, you have to go back a little somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
And you say, well, infinitesimally, but it's still it's a distance in time, or it's a distance yeah, it's some actual distance in time, and which means that nature has memory, fundamentally.
Hmm. That's blown my mind. Yeah.
Awesome. Are there is there opportunity for other people to jump in and questions, or
Well,
maybe we lost?
where Dobson said a while ago about the nature of autoregression and physics and syntax. Uh, so laws of physics as what might be like a syntax in a language
Yes,
system.
yes. Ah, right. That was, yeah, something. Why do we have the physical laws of the universe we do? I mentioned this to somebody recently, and I don't think they
Hmm.
agreed with me at all. It was actually Kurt. And but yeah, that's a beautiful way of putting it. Right, the emergent syntax. So in the case of syntax, linguistic syntax, the idea is that there's something useful about having this particular structure that's good for the particular function it does. Why does the universe have these kinds of regularities? Um, are they, are they Chomskyan like, and like the regularities are imposed from above for some reason that we don't know? Or is there something about self-continuation, something about the way certain kind, like a physical. So here's a wacky idea, but it might blow your mind or it might not. There's the whole question of why there are these kind of regularities and why we have a universe that allows for physical structure and all of that when there are these cosmological constants and all these things that seem fine-tuned for having the kind of structure we do. And so the kind of wacky idea here is that um, you could have lots of different I guess rulal kind of there's lots of ways you could continue um, uh, a sort of an autoregressive process. The one that has persistence is the one that led to the universe we see, and that sort of the syntax of it is the regularities. The regularities we observe are the ones that lend themselves towards a sort of autogenerative persistence. And so that's the universe that exists because that's the one that persists over time. The other ones sort of poof out of existence, kind of like those little particles getting stuck like that. Those get stuck. They don't persist over time. Whereas our universe is the one that it was able to keep going.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
that
We have these conservation laws. I mean, matter and energy and momentum, all these things get conserved. Like
yes,
things just
and they don't
don't,
have to.
not our priority.
Right, not a priori. Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So why do they? Why do we see that? And the answer is, well, it's because that's the ones that won out because they do, because they persist. And so that's the universe that actually exists, as opposed to there were all kinds of hypothetical universes that could have existed and persisted, but they just didn't because they didn't have the conservation.
Huh. Yeah, so you're saying like hypothetical universes that don't have like conservation laws, like things just kind of pop into and out of existence. They just kind of like
Exactly.
they might
Exactly.
fizzle out and not exist anymore.
Yeah.
That's funny.
So you can think of like the singularity as being not only singularity in physics with physics, but all possible physics, and then the ones that we end up getting are the ones that are able to persist.
Michael says that energy isn't conserved in general relativity, though. I guess.
And this is why I probably shouldn't be talking about this stuff.
Well,
Uh,
I wonder how, in what sense, in what scenarios is general relativity not tracking something? Maybe like if the energy is going into space time itself as like gravitational waves or something.
I mean, is energy literally? I mean, I thought it equals mc squared. It doesn't it always get conserved in some sense?
I guess in some dynamical situations,
Well, even if there are
when you
rare
play it
cases
out.
where it doesn't, the point is that it's you can use non-syntactic language, and it works sometimes. But the general rules are that that's what happens, and that's what leads to persistence. That's sort of the right solution for persistence and for continuation. So I don't know if the edge cases maybe don't matter.
I feel like we should be so lucky. Like it's a pretty good universe, and it's bizarre that like matter is made out of of electricity. Um,
Yeah, right. It's pretty cool stuff. But at least it goes some ways to sort of explain like why are there regularities? Like
yeah.
it's not just cosmological, like or there's just persistence. It's like why is there gravity and it's expressible mathematically and it makes you mentioned the syntax of it and I don't have an actual account of this, but I do wonder if those regularities are related to this idea of sort of persistence, that those are the kinds of things that you need in order to sort of get autogenerative. Sorry if you're hearing my dog. Thankfully she was quiet the whole time.
Oh,
Um,
nice.
that lead to persistence. Because it is a bit of a mystery as to why you could have persistence without the regularities. You could, it seems like, or there was necessarily intertwined. There's law-like behaviors and stuff. So to me, this seemed like an epiphany of sorts. I'm still haven't sorted it out by any means, but that somehow the same way that syntax probably is somehow in service of appropriate generation, sort of the syntax of the universe, the regularities are in service of continuous, sort of its own continuation. A very vague idea, but admittedly.
Wow, this has been quite a conversation.
Thank you. Yes, indeed it has. I really appreciate it. And there's a lot to do here. And so I would love to do it together with people like yourself. And I don't mean you all have to jump on the autoregressive train, but as you can see, there's a whole bunch of stuff I'm trying to sort out, including even just how to mathematically try to frame some of this, certainly visualization and things like that. So anybody who finds this interesting and is interested in collaborating, and Dugan, of course, you know already that invitation is more than there.
Yeah, yeah.
I think we're already kind of collaborating, but the Wolfram universe and beyond. It'd be wonderful to be able to interact with all the wonderful people you have
Yeah,
involved in
yeah.
this.
I mean, that visualization has me thinking about, like, I just want to change
Let's
the
talk.
graph and like,
You're
well, I
like,
want to see
let me
the
drag it back to the lab, and I'll share it with you. I
plot
was
the
actually I'll
matrices
share it with you.
and look at all the, like, possible attention heads that could be, you know,
Yep.
derived out of that.
All that good stuff. Exactly. That's where the teleporting happens because these different attention heads are like, actually, we're going to jump there. And they can have completely different ideas. And so you sort of have the local topology that you're making decisions based on, but there's also these highways, kind of like highways, that or almost teleporting from one location to another based on the different attention heads. So yeah, there's so much to try to visualize there.
And yeah, like, to speak to your main theme, like, language does feel very autogenerative, regressional. I mean, every time I, like, find myself stuck in the middle of a sentence, I'm like, I've said this much. I need to, like, say the next couple things with the direction that I have in mind.
Thankfully, we don't have to like actually think about it. Like typically,
Uh-huh.
it sort of takes care of itself. But yes, I know exactly what you mean. It's like the Pledge of Allegiance. You kind of have to be like, oh, I was thinking about that. What did I just say? And then you do it.
Hmm. Absolutely. All right. Let's wrap up.
All
Thanks for
right. Thanks so
everyone.
much.
Thank you, Elon. Elan.
All right. Thanks everybody who joined, and hopefully this. I assume the people will be able to access this. Is this going to go into? Is there a recorded version of this that people will be
It's
able to get if people are trying to?
yeah, it's on YouTube.
Perfect. Awesome. All right. Thank you so much, Dugan. Really appreciate it. Opportunity to chat with you. Always do.
Uh-huh. Thank you again, Elon.